The alien encounter. Zira had always known one thing for certain. Humans were terrifying. The stories whispered among her people painted them as ruthless, violent creatures who destroyed everything they touched. They were invaders from a distant, savage world, spreading chaos across the galaxy. No one from her planet, Valora, had ever survived an encounter with them. At least, that's what she had been told. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment she actually saw one. The crash had come out of nowhere. One minute, Zira was flying her scout ship through the quiet orbit of an uncharted planet. The next, alarms blared in her ears, and her controls spiraled out of command. Something had hit her ship. Maybe debris, maybe a hidden weapon. But whatever it was, it had sent her crashing through the atmosphere like a comet on fire. She remembered the searing heat, the violent shaking, and then darkness. When she woke, the world was silent except for the faint crackling of burning metal. She was pinned beneath a twisted beam, her sleek, violet skin smeared with blood and dirt. Her breathing was ragged, sharp pain stabbing through her side with every inhale. Panic clawed at her chest, but even worse than the pain was the realization. She was stranded, alone. Or so she thought. A sound snapped her attention to the distance, a crunch of boots against rubble. Zira's heart raced. She tried to move, but the weight of the beam held her down. Through the thick smoke, a shadowy figure emerged, and as it came closer, her blood ran cold. A human. Everything about him screamed danger. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with rugged features half hidden beneath dirt and grime. His clothing was torn, patched together with scraps of old fabric and armor. In his hand, he held a strange metal tool, sharp at the edge, glinting under the faint light. Zira's breath hitched. This was it. She was going to die. But the human didn't attack. He paused a few feet away, eyes narrowing as he studied her. Zira braced herself, expecting him to strike. But instead, he did something completely unexpected. He dropped the tool. It clattered against the rocks harmlessly, and slowly, cautiously, he raised his hands in the air, palms open, showing he meant no harm. Zira blinked, confused. Was this a trick? The human took a slow step forward. His voice, deep and rough, broke the tense silence. Zira didn't understand his words, but there was something gentle in his tone. Not the voice of a killer, but of someone trying to help. Still, fear gripped her. She struggled against the beam, trying to free herself. But the pain was too much. The human saw her struggle and moved closer. Zira hissed, baring her sharp teeth in warning. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he crouched beside her, pointing at the beam, then at himself, as if to say, "Let me help you." Zira's mind raced. Could she trust him? Every instinct screamed no, but her body was too weak to resist. She didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, she gave a slight nod. The human sprang into action. He grabbed a piece of metal from the wreckage, using it as leverage against the beam. His muscles strained as he pushed with all his strength, his face contorted with effort. For a moment, it felt hopeless, but then, with a groan of metal, the beam shifted. Zira gasped as the weight lifted from her chest. The human gently pulled her free, careful not to cause more pain. Zira winced but didn't resist. Once she was out, he tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against her bleeding side, trying to stop the flow. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his eyes filled with something Zira never expected to see in a human: compassion. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Zira's heart still pounded, but the fear began to fade, replaced by confusion and curiosity. This human wasn't like the stories. As the pain dulled and exhaustion pulled at her, one thought echoed in her mind. Maybe humans aren't the monsters we think they are. But what did that mean for everything she believed? And why, of all beings in the galaxy, would a human choose to save her life? An unlikely rescue. Zira didn't trust him. She couldn't. Even as the human, Jake, as she later learned, wrapped her wounds with surprising care. Her mind screamed that this was a trap. Her people had warned her about humans. They were cunning, ruthless. They would pretend to help, only to betray you when you were most vulnerable. She had seen the fear in the elders' eyes when they spoke of Earth's people, their voices trembling as they described entire worlds scorched by human greed. But this human, Jake, didn't fit that image. His hands were rough, calloused from hard work, but they moved gently over her injuries, as if afraid to hurt her more. His brow furrowed in concentration, and every so often he mumbled words in his strange guttural language. Zara didn't understand what he was saying, but his tone wasn't threatening. It was soft, almost comforting. Still, her body remained tense, every muscle ready to bolt the moment she had the strength. Once Jake finished binding her wounds, he leaned back on his heels, giving her space. He pointed to himself, tapping his chest. "Jake," he said slowly. Zara just stared at him, her glowing violet eyes narrowing with suspicion. What was he trying to do? Name himself. Why? But he didn't stop there. He pointed at her next, waiting, as if expecting a response. When she didn't answer, he tried again, softer this time. "Jake," he repeated, then gestured at her again. Zara hesitated. Giving him her name felt like surrendering a piece of herself. But maybe if he knew her name, he'd see her as more than just an alien. Maybe he'd see her as someone worth sparing. "Zara," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. Jake's face lit up with a small, satisfied smile. "Zara," he repeated, his human accent twisting the sound slightly, but not unkindly. For a brief moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. Jake stood and glanced around the wreckage, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was starting to dip below the jagged mountains in the distance, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. He motioned toward the horizon, then back at her, making a walking gesture with his fingers. It took Zara a moment to realize what he was saying. "We need to move." Zara tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her side, forcing a gasp from her lips. Jake was beside her in an instant, his hands hovering like he wanted to help but didn't want to frighten her. She shook her head, gritting her teeth against the pain. She didn't want his help. She didn't need it. But the truth was, she did. With a frustrated sigh, Zara finally nodded, allowing him to slide an arm under her shoulders. His touch was warm, steady, and she hated how comforting it felt. Together, they struggled to their feet. Each step sent waves of agony through her body, but Jake was patient, matching her pace, supporting her weight without complaint. They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and the distant howl of wind through the rocky canyons. The planet was barren, its surface scarred by ancient battles and forgotten civilizations. Zara had never felt so small, so fragile. After what felt like hours, they'd reached a small outcrop of rocks, partially shielding a makeshift camp. Jake guided her to a patch of soft sand near a flickering fire pit. The camp was simple, a tattered tarp strung between two jagged rocks, a few metal crates scattered around, and a rusted kettle hanging over the embers. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Jake helped Zara settle down, then rummaged through one of the crates. He pulled out a metal canister, unscrewed the lid, and offered it to her. The liquid inside smelled faintly of minerals and something sweet. Zara hesitated. What if it was poisoned? But Jake took a sip first, then handed it back with an encouraging nod. Reluctantly, Zara accepted the drink. It was cool and refreshing, easing the dryness in her throat. She watched Jake carefully, noting the way he moved, the lines of exhaustion on his face. He didn't seem like a soldier or a killer. If anything, he looked like someone who had been struggling to survive just as much as she was. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Zara shivered, her thin uniform offering little protection against the cold. Jake noticed and disappeared into his small shelter. When he returned, he carried a worn blanket. He approached slowly, holding it out like an offering. Zara tensed, but when he draped it gently over her shoulders, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fabric. They sat in silence, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The stars above were unfamiliar to Zara, distant and cold. But here, in this strange place, with a human by her side, something inside her began to shift. Jake wasn't the monster she'd been told about. But if humans weren't the real threat, who was? Breaking barriers. The next morning came slowly, with the pale light of the twin suns creeping over the jagged rocks like hesitant fingers. Zara awoke to the faint crackle of the dying fire and the sharp sting of pain in her side. Her first instinct was to bolt, to flee into the wilderness, away from the human. But the soreness in her muscles and the throbbing in her ribs reminded her that escape was impossible. Not yet. She turned her head slightly, her sharp, glowing eyes scanning the camp. Jake was nearby, crouched over a small metal device, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered to himself in his strange, guttural language as he tinkered with the parts. Sparks flew briefly from the machine, making Zara flinch. But Jake just sighed and rubbed his face, clearly frustrated. Zara watched him closely. There was no aggression in his movements, no signs of the violent predator she'd been taught to fear. Instead, he seemed tired, worn down by something deeper than just survival. Her stomach growled unexpectedly, a loud, embarrassing sound in the quiet camp. Jake's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Zara's heart pounded. She expected him to laugh, or worse, use her weakness against her. But instead, he gave a small, understanding smile. Without a word, he stood and rummaged through one of the crates. He pulled out a small, round object, roughly the size of a valerian fruit, but with a hard, uneven shell. He approached slowly, holding it out to her like an offering. Zara stared at the object suspiciously. It could be poisoned. It could be a trap. But Jake didn't force it on her. He simply set it down within her reach and stepped back. Then, to her surprise, he pulled out another one for himself. He sat down across from her, cracked the shell open with a small tool, and began to eat. Zara watched him closely. He chewed thoughtfully, making no effort to rush her. After a few moments, she reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the strange food. She sniffed it cautiously. It smelled odd, but not unpleasant. With a deep breath, she cracked it open, mimicking Jake's actions. The inside was soft, with a faint, sweet aroma. She took a small bite, ready to spit it out at the first sign of bitterness. But to her surprise, it tasted good, better than anything she'd had since the crash. Jake watched her with a satisfied grin, nodding as if to say, "See, not so bad, right?" For the first time since they met, Zara felt the tension in her chest loosen. As the day wore on, Jake tried to communicate more. He pointed at things around the camp, saying their names slowly and clearly. "Fire," he said, gesturing at the glowing embers. "Rock." He tapped a nearby stone. "Water," he added, holding up the canister he'd given her the night before. Zara listened, her sharp mind absorbing the strange sounds. After a while, she began to mimic him, repeating the words back with her own accent. Some were easier than others, and Jake chuckled softly whenever she stumbled, but not in a cruel way. His laughter was light, warm. It made her cheeks flush with a strange heat she didn't understand. Eventually, Jake pointed at himself again. "Jake," he repeated, tapping his chest. Then he pointed at her. Zara hesitated but finally responded, "Zara." Jake's smile widened. "Zara," he echoed, his voice gentle. They spent hours like that, trading words and gestures, slowly building a fragile bridge between their worlds. Zara found herself fascinated by the human language, the way certain sounds rolled off the tongue while others felt sharp and foreign. She taught him a few words from her own language, and though his pronunciation was terrible, he seemed genuinely interested in learning. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky landscape. Jake stood and motioned for Zira to follow him. She hesitated, unsure of his intentions, but curiosity got the better of her. She struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on a makeshift cane Jake had fashioned for her earlier. They walked a short distance from the camp to a small ridge overlooking a vast, barren valley. The view was both beautiful and haunting, with the twin suns casting an otherworldly glow over the jagged terrain. Jake pointed out into the distance, his expression serious. He spoke a few words Zira didn't understand, but his tone made it clear. He was explaining something important. He traced a path through the air with his finger, gesturing toward the horizon, where a dark shape loomed in the distance. Zira squinted, her sharp vision picking out the faint outline of what looked like a structure, maybe an old ship or a human outpost. Whatever it was, it sent a shiver down her spine. Jake turned to her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear. Determination. He pointed at the structure, then back at the camp, and finally at her. His message was clear. We need to get there. Together. Zira felt a swirl of emotions. The idea of relying on a human for survival still felt wrong, like betraying everything she'd been taught. But deep down, she knew she couldn't make it alone. And more importantly, she realized something else. Jake wasn't just helping her because he had to. He wanted to help. That night, as they sat by the fire, Zira found herself watching Jake in a new light. His face, lined with dirt and exhaustion, seemed softer under the flickering glow. His eyes, though tired, held a quiet strength. For the first time since the crash, Zira didn't feel completely alone. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, everything she'd been taught about humans was wrong. The real threat. Zira had spent her whole life fearing humans. They were the stories whispered to Velaran children at night, the ruthless invaders who conquered planets, burned civilizations, and bent entire species to their will. Yet here she was, sitting beside one, eating food he had given her, wearing a blanket he had draped over her shoulders, and listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as the fire between them flickered in the cold night. It didn't make sense. If Jake was like the humans she had been warned about, then why had he saved her? Why hadn't he left her to die in the wreckage? And why did he keep helping her, even when she was weak, even when she was a burden? She should have been more careful. She should have remembered that humans were supposed to be unpredictable, dangerous, because the real danger was still out there, watching. The first sign came in the middle of the night, a sharp, unnatural hum in the distance, like metal grinding against metal. Zira's sensitive ears twitched at the sound, and her eyes snapped open. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the rocky ground. Jake was still asleep, his back against a crate, breathing deeply. She held her breath and listened. There it was again, a faint vibration through the ground, a sound that didn't belong. Something, or someone, was coming. Her heart pounded as she reached out, shaking Jake awake. He stirred, groggy at first, but the urgency in her glowing violet eyes made him snap to full alertness. She pressed a finger to her lips, motioning for silence. Jake frowned but nodded, immediately understanding. Then he heard it too. His body tensed. He moved with practiced caution, reaching for a battered rifle that had been hidden beneath his pack. Zira's eyes narrowed. He had a weapon. Of course he did. The thought made her stomach twist, but now wasn't the time for doubt. Jake gestured toward the darkness beyond the camp, then pointed to his ear, signaling for her to listen. Zira obeyed, straining her senses. Voices, distant but getting closer. Not just human voices. There were others mixed in, the guttural clicks and hisses of species Zira recognized from her travels. Mercenaries, scavengers. They were looking for something, or someone. A sudden, sharp beep rang through the air, and Zira felt her blood run cold. A scanning drone. Jake grabbed her wrist and pulled her down behind a cluster of rocks, just as a red light swept over the camp. The drone hovered above the ruins of her crashed ship, its scanner whirring as it processed the wreckage. Zyra's pulse thundered in her ears. If they found the ship, they would know she had survived. If they knew she had survived, they would come looking. She turned to Jake, panic flashing in her eyes. She had to run. She had to get as far away from here as possible before. Too late. A sharp voice cut through the night air. Valoran ship confirmed. Survivors likely. Zyra froze. That voice. She recognized it. Commander Vekran. He was a bounty hunter. A ruthless one. His crew specialized in tracking down high-value targets, and Zyra was now one of them. Jake's grip on her wrist tightened. His blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with silent determination. He wasn't going to leave her. Zyra had no time to question why. The moment the drone turned away, Jake pulled her toward the rocks, moving fast but silent. They needed to put distance between themselves and the camp before Vekran's crew arrived. But they weren't fast enough. A blast of energy struck the ground near them, sending up a cloud of dust and rock. Jake yanked Zyra behind cover just as more shots rang out, the air humming with deadly heat. A voice echoed through the canyon. "Come out, Valoran. We know you're here." Zyra clenched her teeth. Vekran wasn't just here for salvage. He was hunting her. Jake's jaw tightened. He gestured toward a narrow passage between the rocks, a silent signal that they had to move. Zyra hesitated. If she went with him, she was putting him in danger. But if she stayed, she was dead. Another blast exploded nearby, forcing her decision. She followed Jake, moving as quickly as her injured body would allow. They wove through the rocky terrain, dodging bursts of gunfire and keeping to the shadows. The mercenaries were closing in, but Jake seemed to know the land better than they did. He led Zyra through winding paths, doubling back and using the uneven ground to mask their tracks. Still, it wouldn't be enough. Vekran's crew had numbers, resources, drones, and worst of all, time. Eventually, Zyra and Jake slid into a narrow crevice between two rock formations, catching their breath. Zyra's side throbbed, her vision swimming from exhaustion. Jake exhaled sharply, pressing his back against the stone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a small rusted device. He pressed a few buttons, and a faint blue light flickered to life on the screen. A map, a signal, a possible escape. Zyra studied the screen, her mind racing. The structure they had seen earlier, the one Jake had pointed to the night before, was their best chance. If they could reach it, they might find a way off this planet. But they would have to make it there first. And with Vekran and his mercenaries closing in, that would be easier said than done. Zyra swallowed hard. The fear, the pain, the exhaustion, it didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered now was surviving. And for the first time, she wasn't doing it alone. The chase. The planet's landscape stretched out like a cruel labyrinth, each jagged rock and shadowy canyon, a potential trap waiting to be sprung. Zyra and Jake moved through the harsh terrain, their breaths ragged, their steps uneven. The mercenaries were relentless, and every passing minute felt like a tightening noose around their necks. The sun's twin rays, once a beacon of hope, now cast eerie, elongated shadows that danced mockingly around them. Zyra's body screamed in protest. Every step sent sharp pain lancing through her side where her ribs had cracked during the crash. The makeshift bandages Jake had wrapped around her earlier were soaked through, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on her like the heavy beam that had pinned her in the wreckage. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Jake led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, searching for signs of danger, or worse, signs of Vekran's crew. His rifle was slung over his back, but he hadn't fired it yet. They both knew that the moment they engaged in a fight, the mercenaries would close in with full force. Stealth was their only advantage. But stealth had its limits. A sudden, sharp hum split the air. Zyra froze mid-step, her heart lurching into her throat. She recognized that sound instantly. Drones. Jake heard it too. He grabbed her arm and yanked her into the shadow of a nearby rock formation just as a sleek black drone zipped overhead, its red scanning lights sweeping across the ground. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, barely daring to breathe as the drone hovered for a moment, its mechanical eye flickering. Zyra's mind raced. If the drone scanned the area thoroughly, it would pick up their heat signatures. They had seconds, maybe less. Jake's hand tightened around hers, and with a quick motion, he pointed toward a narrow crevice in the rocks a few meters away. Without waiting for her response, he bolted, dragging her along with him. The moment they moved, the drone's red light flared. An alarm blared through the canyon, loud and piercing, shattering the silence like glass. "They're here," a distant voice shouted, amplified through a communicator. The Velaran and the human, heading northeast. Zyra's blood ran cold. They were exposed. Jake didn't slow down. His grip on her wrist was firm but careful, as if he was both leading her to safety and making sure he didn't hurt her in the process. They sprinted through the crevice, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Behind them, the drone zipped after them, its alarm still wailing. Then came the gunfire. Blaster shots hissed through the air, striking the rocks around them and sending shards of stone flying. Zyra ducked instinctively, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. They rounded a bend in the canyon and stumbled into a wide clearing, a dead end. Jagged cliffs loomed on all sides, their sharp edges cutting into the sky like teeth. Zyra's breath hitched. They were trapped. Jake skidded to a halt, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for an escape route. The drone hovered at the entrance to the canyon, blocking their only exit. Behind it, the mercenaries' voices grew louder as they closed in. For a moment, panic gripped Zyra's chest. This was it. This was how it ended. But Jake wasn't giving up. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with determination. He pointed to a narrow ledge halfway up the cliffside, barely visible in the fading light. It was dangerous, more than dangerous, but it was their only chance. Zyra's mind screamed in protest. She was injured. She could barely walk, let alone climb. But Jake was already moving, boosting her up toward the ledge with surprising strength. "Climb," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. Zyra gritted her teeth and forced her body to move. The pain in her side flared with every pull, but she focused on the rough texture of the rocks beneath her fingers, on the sound of Jake's voice urging her upward. Blaster shots ricocheted off the cliffside, some coming dangerously close. Zyra felt the heat of one shot singe the edge of her uniform, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Jake was right behind her, his strong hands pushing her higher when she faltered. When she reached the ledge, she collapsed onto it, gasping for breath. Jake scrambled up beside her just as a blaster shot struck the rock where he'd been standing moments before. But they weren't safe yet. The mercenaries had spotted them. Shouts echoed through the canyon as Vekran's crew spread out below, their weapons trained on the cliffside. Jake pulled his rifle from his back, his jaw set in grim determination. He handed Zyra a small round device, a flash grenade, she realized. He motioned for her to stay low, then leaned out over the ledge and fired a few quick shots. The mercenaries returned fire instantly, the canyon filling with the deafening sound of blaster fire. Jake ducked back behind the rock, his breathing heavy but steady. Zyra knew they couldn't hold this position for long. The mercenaries would find another way up. They had to keep moving. Jake seemed to read her thoughts. He pointed farther along the ledge, where it narrowed into a precarious path that snaked along the cliffside. It was risky, one wrong step, and they'd fall, but it was their only option. Zyra nodded, clutching the flash grenade tightly in her hand. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for the pain, and then she moved. The ledge was even narrower than it looked from a distance. The rocks crumbled underfoot, and the wind howled through the canyon, threatening to knock them off balance. Zyra's heart pounded in her ears as she focused on each step, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Behind them, Jake fired another shot, then followed her along the ledge. When they were halfway across, the mercenaries found a second path up the cliff. Shouts rang out, and blaster fire peppered the rocks around them. Zyra knew this was it, the moment they either escaped or fell. She pulled the pin on the flash grenade and hurled it toward the advancing mercenaries. A blinding burst of light and sound filled the canyon, followed by shouts of confusion and disarray. Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. They sprinted the last few meters of the ledge, reaching a narrow opening in the rock that led to a hidden cave system. They stumbled inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. The sounds of the mercenaries faded behind them, muffled by the twisting tunnels. For the first time in hours, they stopped running. Zyra collapsed against the cold stone wall, her chest heaving. Jake sank down beside her, his face drenched in sweat, his eyes still sharp and alert. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ragged rhythm of their breathing, mingling in the darkness. Then, slowly, Zyra turned to Jake. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Why are you helping me?" Jake met her gaze, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite understand, something deeper than duty or survival. "Because," he said quietly, "you needed me." And in that moment, Zyra realized something she had never expected. She needed him too. The last stand. The cave swallowed them whole, its walls damp and cold, the darkness thick enough to suffocate. Zyra and Jake pressed forward, their breaths ragged, each step a battle against exhaustion. The narrow passage twisted and turned like the spine of some ancient creature, the only light coming from the faint glow of Zyra's skin and the dim, flickering beam of Jake's cracked flashlight. For a while, the sound of their pursuers faded into the distance, muffled by layers of rock. But Zyra knew it wouldn't last. Vikran and his mercenaries were too skilled to lose track of them for long, and with her injuries slowing them down, their time was running out. As they moved deeper into the tunnels, the walls began to widen, opening into a cavernous space. The ceiling stretched high above them, covered in glowing crystals that pulsed with a faint, eerie light. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth, and the floor was uneven, littered with ancient debris from civilizations long forgotten. Jake paused at the edge of the cavern, his eyes scanning the shadows for threats. Zyra leaned against the wall, her side throbbing with every breath. She could feel the warmth of fresh blood seeping through the bandages. She was getting weaker. But she couldn't stop now. Jake turned to her, his face etched with worry. He didn't need to say anything. Zyra could see it in his eyes. He knew she was running out of strength, but instead of suggesting they rest, he simply nodded, silently asking if she could keep going. Zyra clenched her jaw and nodded back. She wasn't going to let him carry this burden alone. They crossed the cavern carefully, their footsteps echoing off the walls. On the far side, a narrow passage led upward, toward the surface. It was steep and treacherous, but Zyra could see faint light filtering through the cracks above. Freedom was close. Too close. A sudden noise, a sharp metallic clatter, echoed through the cavern behind them. Zyra's heart stopped. Jake spun around, raising his rifle as shadows moved in the tunnel they had just left. The mercenaries had found them. Vikran's voice rang out, cold and mocking, amplified by a communicator. "You can't run forever, Velaran. And your human friend can't save you." Zyra's blood boiled at the sound of his voice. She had seen what Vikran was capable of. He didn't take prisoners. He didn't offer mercy. If they were caught, there would be no negotiations. Jake's jaw tightened. He looked at Zyra, his eyes blazing with determination. "We make our stand here," he whispered. Zyra nodded, her fear melting into resolve. She wasn't going to die cowering in a cave. Jake moved quickly, setting up what little cover they could find behind a fallen pillar. He handed Zyra a small blaster he had tucked in his belt, and for the first time, she realized just how much he trusted her. She wasn't just a burden to him. She was his partner in this fight. The first shot rang out, searing through the cavern and striking the wall near Jake's head. He ducked behind the pillar, returning fire with quick, precise bursts. The mercenaries flooded into the cavern, their weapons blazing, their shouts echoing off the walls. Zaira took a deep breath, ignoring the pain in her side, and fired into the chaos. Her aim was shaky at first, but she quickly found her rhythm. The blaster felt strange in her hands, but the anger burning in her chest fueled her. For every mercenary that fell, 2 more took their place. But Zaira and Jake fought like cornered beasts, their desperation making them fierce. They moved together as if they had been fighting side by side for years, covering each other's blind spots, shouting warnings when danger crept too close. But even their combined efforts couldn't hold off the inevitable. A grenade rolled into their cover, its blinking light casting harsh shadows on the walls. Jake's eyes widened, and without thinking, he threw himself over Zaira, shielding her with his body as the explosion ripped through the air. The blast sent them flying. Zaira hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. She struggled to sit up, her vision swimming. Jake lay a few feet away, motionless. "Jake!" she screamed, crawling toward him. He groaned, his face contorted in pain, but he was alive. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and his breathing was ragged, but his eyes opened when she shook him. "I'm fine," he whispered, though it was clear he wasn't. "Keep going." Zaira's heart clenched. She couldn't leave him. But the mercenaries were closing in, their footsteps pounding against the cavern floor. Vekran emerged from the shadows, his cold eyes locking onto Zaira. He raised his weapon, aiming directly at her. Zaira's mind raced. She had one shot, one chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed Jake's rifle from the ground and fired. The shot struck Vekran in the shoulder, sending him staggering back. But it wasn't enough. Vekran recovered quickly, his face twisted in rage. He raised his weapon again, ready to finish them both. But Jake wasn't done yet. With the last of his strength, he pulled Zaira down behind cover and tossed something toward Vekran, a small, metal sphere blinking with a soft blue light. A pulse grenade. The explosion was silent but devastating. A wave of energy rippled through the cavern, knocking the mercenaries off their feet and frying their weapons. Vekran screamed in fury as his blaster short-circuited, sparks flying from the barrel. The mercenaries hesitated, their confidence shattered. And in that moment of confusion, Zaira saw their chance. She helped Jake to his feet, supporting his weight as they stumbled toward the narrow passage leading upward. The light grew brighter with each step, hope burning in Zaira's chest like a flame. Behind them, Vekran shouted orders, but his voice was distant now, fading into the echoes of the cavern. They reached the surface just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The air was cool and fresh, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the cave. Zaira collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Jake sank beside her, his face pale but smiling. For a long moment, they just lay there, staring at the sky. They had survived. But as Zaira looked at Jake, her heart ached. He had risked everything for her. A human, someone she had been taught to fear, had saved her life more times than she could count. And now it was her turn to save him. She reached into the small pouch at her side, pulling out the emergency beacon she had salvaged from her crashed ship. She activated it, sending a signal into the sky. Her people would come for her. But would they come for Jake? Zaira didn't know. But she would fight for him. Because in the end, he wasn't just a human. He was her friend. A new understanding. The morning light was pale and cool, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The air felt thin at this altitude, but to Zaira, it was the breath of hope. She sat beside Jake, the emergency beacon pulsing faintly between them, sending its signal into the void of space. Somewhere out there, her people would be receiving it, calculating her coordinates, preparing a rescue. But rescue felt complicated now. Jake lay next to her, his breathing uneven, his face pale from blood loss. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but the deeper wound, one Zara couldn't see, was in his side. The pulse grenade blast had saved them, but it had also thrown shrapnel into Jake's abdomen. His strength had carried them to the surface, but now, with the adrenaline gone, his body was shutting down. Zara pressed her hands against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. Human biology was different from hers. She didn't know how much longer he could hold on. Jake's eyes fluttered open, their usual sharp blue now dulled by pain. When he saw her, he managed a weak smile. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Zara swallowed hard. Safe wasn't the right word. She had survived, yes, but without Jake, the cost of survival felt unbearable. "Help is coming," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was for his comfort or her own. Jake's smile faded slightly, his gaze drifting toward the sky. "Not for me," he murmured. "They'll come for you." Zara's heart twisted. He was right. Her people would never expect her to be traveling with a human, much less friends with one. They would see Jake as a threat, a remnant of the enemy they'd been taught to fear. But Zara wasn't going to let that happen. "You saved me," she whispered fiercely. "I'm not going to let them hurt you." Jake chuckled weakly, the sound catching in his throat. "I didn't save you because I expected anything." He paused, wincing from the effort. "I saved you because it's the right thing to do." Zara stared at him, her heart pounding. The words felt so simple, but they carried weight she'd never understood before. On Valora, survival was everything. You help your own kind, your own people, but strangers. Aliens, you left them behind. You didn't risk your life for someone from a species you barely understood. But Jake had. And now, Zara realized she couldn't go back to the way things were before. The minutes stretched into hours as they waited. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its harsh light over the rocky terrain. Zara stayed by Jake's side, holding his hand, whispering words of encouragement even when she wasn't sure he could hear them. She felt his grip weaken, his breathing slow. Then, just as hope began to slip through her fingers, a distant hum filled the air. Zara's head snapped up. A sleek Velarine ship descended from the sky, its silver hull gleaming in the sunlight. It hovered for a moment before lowering to the ground with a soft hiss. The ship's doors slid open, and a group of Velarine soldiers emerged, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the area for threats. Zara stood slowly, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She waved her arms, signaling to the soldiers. "I'm here," she called out, her voice hoarse. The soldiers rushed forward, their eyes widening when they saw her condition. But their gaze quickly shifted to Jake, lying motionless on the ground. One of the soldiers, a tall Velarine with sharp features, pointed his weapon at Jake. "Is he a threat?" the soldier demanded, his voice cold. Zara's heart pounded. She stepped in front of Jake, her arms outstretched. "No," she said firmly. "He saved my life." The soldier hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "He's human." "I don't care," Zara snapped. "He's coming with me." The soldier exchanged glances with his comrades. They weren't used to hearing defiance, especially from someone in Zara's condition. But there was something in her voice, something unyielding, that made them lower their weapons. Reluctantly, they moved forward, lifting Jake onto a stretcher. Zara stayed close, refusing to let them separate her from him. As they boarded the ship, Zara felt the weight of her decision settle over her. She didn't know what would happen when they reached Valora. She didn't know if her people would accept Jake, or if they'd see him as an enemy. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let him die alone. The ship's interior was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth she felt when she was with Jake. The medical team worked quickly, scanning his injuries and stabilizing his condition. Zara sat by his side the entire time, refusing to leave even when the medics insisted. Hours passed in a blur of lights and sounds. Zyra didn't sleep. She couldn't. She watched Jake's chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile thread connecting him to life. When the ship finally landed on Valora, Zyra braced herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. The moment the doors opened, she was met by a delegation of Valoran officials, their faces stern and unyielding. "What is this?" one of them demanded, pointing at Jake. "Why have you brought a human here?" Zyra stood tall, her exhaustion forgotten. "He saved my life," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm going to save his." The officials murmured among themselves, their expressions a mix of confusion and anger. Valorans didn't know humans anything, but Zyra's words carried weight, more than she realized. Over the next few days, word of her story spread across Valora. The tale of a human who had risked everything to save a Valoran challenged the deeply ingrained fears and prejudices her people held. Some refused to believe it. Others were curious, their minds opening to the possibility that humans weren't the monsters they had been taught to fear. Zyra stayed by Jake's side, watching as he slowly recovered. When he finally opened his eyes, she was there, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. "You made it," she whispered. Jake smiled weakly. "Told you I would." As the days turned into weeks, Zyra realized that her world had changed forever. The lines between friend and enemy had blurred, replaced by something deeper, an understanding that transcended species and history. And as she walked through the halls of Valora with Jake by her side, she knew that their story was just the beginning. Because the universe would never see humans, or Valorans, the same way again.